Hello and welcome. Welcome, one and all, back to the Light 'em Up Lounge. It's Wednesday yet again. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are around the world. It is a pleasure to welcome you back to another highly interesting conversation and special feature with Charlie Minato from Halfwheel. And I'm delighted and honored to have Charlie with us today, sharing some of his personal story and his journey with cigars, the evolution of Halfwheel that has become a primary voice for the premium cigar industry over the last years, and who is one of the most well respected and well known figures in the cigar media landscape. So without further ado, Charlie, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thanks for taking the time, and welcome to the Light 'em Up
Thank you for
Lounge.
having me, Reinhard.
Charlie, let me start with a sort of generic question that I'm very curious about, and I would love to know, how do you in general define the role and the responsibility of a journalist, and in particular a cigar media professional?
I believe that journalism fundamentally is taking the complicated and making it simple. Um, no matter what you're doing, I think as a journalist, whether it's in a more traditional role, in reporting news and sort of what's happening around a place, or whether it's politics or sports or whatever it is, ultimately these are immensely complicated situations, whether it's a car crash or a football match or an election. And journalists have a responsibility, and their role is to contextualize what happened, to describe what happened as accurately as they can, to try to find people that may have, not necessarily experts, but people that have different perspectives and maybe can go more in depth. And then, to more or less research the shit out of it, and make sure that the journalist who's writing about whatever they're writing about, can speak from some position of authority. Obviously, they're not university professors. They don't dedicate their entire lives to covering or to understanding a car crash or a singular election or a sporting event. There are people that do that. There are people that spend their entire lives, researching World War I, for example. Journals aren't that, but they are responsible for taking something complex and making it simple. In my mind, I think there was a second part of that question.
I mean, it was just in regards to the cigar media side in particular, if you see any difference in that compared to what you just said about journalism in general.
Cigar media is, you're in niche media. First of all, I think it's important to understand that whether it's cigars or watches or cars or whatever, you've already isolated yourself out into a pretty specific role. And when you're focused on covering an industry that's got a product, then you really are just, I think, the responsibility is to have, an understanding of the product to a certain capability. But at the end of the day, I'm not a cigar buncher. I'm not a tobacco grower. I'm not a box maker. There are many parts of the business that I have, only an elementary level of knowledge about. But in terms of the larger role of cigar media, I think we look at our jobs at Halfwheel to report on what's happening in the cigar business. That's not the only part of cigar media. Obviously, things like this, we don't host live shows, but I would certainly consider this to be part of cigar media. And so I think there are many different outlets serving different roles within cigar media. And, I'm sort of one that believes that the more the merrier. I don't think that it's worth sort of sitting here and being like, okay, is an influencer part of cigar media, or is a YouTube show part of cigar media, or maybe the YouTube show's not, but a podcaster is for some reason. I look at it all the same. It's all part of the sort of, these are people who are talking about, writing about, shooting video about cigars with the, end goal of trying to get other people to consume that media, whether it's in a podcast form, whether it's in a magazine, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a blog, whether it's on a show like this.
Mm-hmm. It sometimes feels like, especially in a small industry like the premium cigar world, it's a delicate dance and a tricky balance between the media and the manufacturer side, or other stakeholders and players of the industry, because it's an ecosystem and should be a peaceful coexistence where one always heavily depends on the other. So we're, it's sort of a back and forth, and we all need each other. Yet it sometimes comes to a point where it feels conflicted, or there's various different interests at stake. With Cigar Media depending on some of the industry money, yet also taking an independent role, be it through reviews or criticizing in the most open and honest way what's going on in the industry. How do you think about that in general? And do you actually feel that there's sometimes like an inevitable conflict of interest?
I don't know if there's necessarily an inevitable conflict of interest. I do think that I disagree with your sentiment that it's peaceful or should be peaceful or needs to be peaceful. I don't think that that's the role of media, whether it's in the cigar world or really anything else. Media is supposed to see what happens and report about what happens, even if it's not flattering. And I think that, in the US, we had an incident a couple weeks ago where in American football, there was a bit of a scandal involving a coach that said some things, but in the process of it, there were some reporters' emails that got leaked. And this is a pretty high profile reporter for the American part of the audience, Adam Schefter, who's, I think one of sort of the most prominent, if not the most prominent journalists covering the NFL. His emails got leaked and they were not flattering as far as you're looking at this guy as an independent source of media. You could really see him being part of the ecosystem and being a cog that wasn't just there to see what happens, report what happens. It was, more complicated, and it's probably worth explaining here. But that's not the role of media as far as I'm concerned. I mean, these cigar companies, if they want to just have Instagram accounts or websites or YouTube channels that say nice things about their cigars, they certainly have the budgets and the capabilities of producing those. I think that the idea that there's going to be conflict is something that was foreign to most people in the cigar business up until Halfwheel was getting started. It at least seemed like it was. I wasn't there 25 years ago, so I don't know. Maybe there was more conflict, but yeah, for the most part, there weren't very many low ratings published. There weren't news stories written that people may not have been, I don't say comfortable sharing that information, but maybe wanted to share that information a couple weeks later than it was being shared. Just all sorts of different aspects of like, hey, this is an industry that has existed for a long time, has a really interesting media dynamic with Cigar Aficionado being, as an outsized sort of importance as it is compared to its competitors at the time. And that created this weird scenario where a lot of this stuff just was never reported on positively or negatively. And then, sort of having people like Halfwheel and others who have taken an approach of we're going to produce multiple news stories on a daily basis means that a lot of this stuff is being written about that wouldn't have been written about 15 years ago. And occasionally, sometimes that upsets people.
Because you briefly touched upon that, how do you see the evolution of cigar media in general? You mentioned Cigar Aficionado and how that certainly changed the entire landscape. Halfwheel most definitely made a significant contribution to shaking things up. And COVID, obviously, with the dynamic of the last 2 years, sort of brought a new element to the table where more of these virtual events pop up and live shows that give us an opportunity to find a direct link between the end consumer, people in the middle, and the manufacturers. But looking at the picture in a more holistic way, how do you think about that evolution over those past years?
I mean, I think we're lagging behind. I think that you look at other industries. I mean, it's always important to remember the cigar industry is quite small in comparison to things like whiskey or cigarettes or e-cigarettes for that matter. But you look at sort of the emerging or the newer media platforms. I would say YouTube is no longer considered to be that, but for the cigar industry, it probably still is. There are a couple of YouTube channels that have, carved out audiences. A lot of them are more or less retailers who have YouTube channels, but there aren't a ton of independent sort of YouTube personas that have sizable audiences And most of the ones, quite frankly, that do, the two that immediately come to my mind are Cigar Obsession and Cigar Vixen. They're not relatively new. I mean, Cigar Obsession in particular has been around longer than Halfwheel has. But that is concerning because I think in an industry where your products are regulated and where oftentimes a lot of these internet conglomerates are hesitant to allow tobacco related channels or accounts to have maybe the full access of all the tools that they've got, and certainly on more traditional stuff like television, there's even more restrictions. That's just it shows that the development is stagnant, and the development, quite frankly, may have always been stagnant. Maybe it's the case that cigar blogs didn't develop at the same rate as comparison to sort of general industry did 15 years ago. I don't really know that to the full extent, but I think there is
Why do you
some.
think is that? I mean, sorry if I interrupt you there, but
Yeah.
um, why do you think that that's even the case? Is it because of the size of the industry, of the outside issues when it comes to the regulatory matters, or just because the industry is probably old fashioned in certain ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of factors. I do think that, the idea that you've got a product that is, that I think everyone in the industry kind of agrees should not be marketed towards children means that the acquisition of new consumers of media has to start when they're 18 or increasingly now 21. And so you compare that to something like sports or automobiles or whatever, and you just are like, you're starting it off. A consumer for cigar media is day one is going to be already be an adult, and that means that they've already made a lot of choices about what they're interested or not interested in. And I think you pair that. I don't know how it breaks down in Europe and the rest of the world, but here in the States, the vast majority of cigars or cigar consumers are people that buy less than a box a year. They're people that go into a cigar shop maybe once or twice. Maybe they're at a friend's house and somebody gives them a cigar. And over the course of the year, maybe they consume 10 cigars or light up 10 cigars. And maybe they actually finish half of them. Whatever the case is, it's not the people that are going to be watching your show or reading Halfwheel, quite frankly. That's a real small percentage, at least in the American market, of the total consumers. And then it becomes a question of, okay, if we have one of these people, or even maybe somebody that's in between those two categories, are they ever going to interact with cigar media, or are they just going to go into the store and, look at a cigar and it looks pretty and that they put it, in their basket and go to the counter and pay for it? And so there's a lot of inherent disadvantages, but I do think that cigar media maybe isn't in the healthiest of place, particularly when it comes to advancing and evolving.
Let's go back a little bit in time. And I know at some point you were an intern, I believe, at Business Insider, and had a cigar related project before starting Halfwheel. But just in terms of Halfwheel itself, what was the intention when you started the project and how it all came to life? Was it because you saw an opportunity with everything that was missing and what you just described? Was it sort of a gut feeling that you wanted to make that contribution, or more from a business perspective where you saw an opportunity that you wanted to venture into?
Uh, Not really any of those things, I think, specifically. So I was 2010. I started a website called the Cigar Feed, which was one of sort of the two precursors to Halfwheel, and the Cigar Feed did a lot of the same things that Halfwheel did, and particularly what it did that was different than the cigar blogs that existed at the time was it did a lot more news. I reviewed cigars and I had other people reviewing cigars at the Cigar Feed, but there was also just not anywhere close to what it is at Halfwheel, but there was probably more news content on the Cigar Feed than anywhere else on the internet at that point, even if it's a fraction of what Halfwheel does right now. And so I was reporting about cigars, which meant that I was having to, a lot of times call people and ask them about, hey, I heard you have this new cigar upcoming. Do you have any more details about it? Because quite frankly, most of the manufacturers weren't used to promoting their cigars to media. They just sort of came up with a new cigar. Maybe they called one of the magazines and let them know. But for the most part, they just started selling the cigars through their sales channels, and that was that. And so I was doing a lot of that work, and at the same time, I stumbled across a blog called Smoking Stogie, which was founded by Brooks Winnington, who's now one of the business partners at Halfwheel. And Brooks was a professional photographer at the time. He was a high-end wedding photographer. He previously photographed for newspapers when he was younger, and he was reviewing cigars that were rare, hard to find, expensive. Increasingly, it was getting less and less of that, but it was still a website that you would go to, and it would just be, more or less like going to a car magazine that said we're only going to review supercars. It was the Flor Dominicana, El Museos. It was whatever the next Taiwahe single store release was, Grand Reservas, cigars from the 30s, etc. And there was a lot of high quality photography, but the stories themselves to me were always interesting. So as a consumer of cigar media, Smoking Stogie was really the only other website that I actually enjoyed reading, because a lot of the cigars on there were things that I never thought I would necessarily be able to smoke, and also because a lot of times I'd never heard of some of these crazy things that they were reviewing. And as it so happened, Brooks was expanding into trying to review pre-release cigars, so getting the cigars and reviewing them before the cigar shipped to stores, as part of the sort of Smoking Stogie's going to review weird things mantra that he had. And that meant that Brooks and I were doing a lot of the same work, because I would be calling stores about, hey, I heard you have a new Taiwahe single store release coming next month. Do you have any details about it? And then Brooks would call the store and be like, hey, is there any way that I could buy one ahead of time and review it the day before or whatever? And Brooks happened to be in Dallas. My parents lived in Dallas. I was going to university at the time in North Carolina. And so we met up and, quickly became friends, given that we were doing a lot of the same work. And it seemed pretty clear that there were some things that he was really good at, photography, and also, the design sort of how he was reviewing cigars was probably, I think I had knocked off some of the aspects of it, but a lot of it was, basically what we do at Halfwheel today. And there was other parts of the business or of being a cigar blogger, the tech side, as well as just the whole idea of reporting news, that I was much better at. And it seemed like if we put those two things together and maybe did some other things, made some improvements from a technological standpoint, made a website that, at the time, most of these websites did not have a iPhone version. This was 2011. And so you would go to one of these websites and it was impossible to read on your phone, because they hadn't bothered to, spend the time or the money or think about people might want to read this stuff on their phones. And so things like that. And we figured if we put all those things together, we would have something that was much greater than the sum of its parts.
Two interesting components there. When looking at Halfwheel's original mission to be information forward, it most definitely did evolve into a ratings competitor with other sites that are out there. And we all know that the top 25 lists and the reviews and the ratings, that's what a lot of people look at. And then ultimately you also end up in comparing those various different sources and how they sort of come together. Did it feel for you like the core mission was always to be information driven, or is the rating component where you see most of consumers' interest now?
I think when we started, the idea was that it was going to be 50-50. The only, we didn't have a ton of grand plans for what Halfwheel was going to be. The idea was that it needed to be better than not only the two blogs that it was replacing, but also better than what would happen if we just combined them. It wasn't good enough to just do that. The mantra was we wanted to create the cigar blog that we wanted to read. And to some degree, that's still the case. There are some things we do that I, quite frankly, am not terribly interested in, but there are other things, and there are ways that we approach things. If I was going to review a cigar cutter, it would be the way that we review cigar cutters at Halfwheel, and with all the different components. But as far as when we started, the reviews, I would say, were more, they were larger drivers of traffic than the news stories were. But we also weren't doing news the same way that we were doing now. And we started, legislation was not something, and I don't know what the number is, but we probably publish less than 150 legislation stories the first year on the site. And by 2014 or 2015, that number was probably, somewhere between 500 and 800. So, and the overall news production, the amount of news stories we were writing in general went up as well. Now it's the case that the news stories are a larger source of traffic than the cigar reviews, but that's probably just due to the fact that we publish probably for every cigar review, we probably publish 4 news stories, something like that. So it's just sort of a numbers game.
I would love to come back to the review and ratings topic a little later, but just in regards to the information, it it feels odd, and you mentioned this before, that information is somewhat scattered or just non-existent in our industry and seems tricky to come by. Has the way that you do research or the way you approach manufacturers to get decent and accurate information changed over the years, or is it still very tricky to get a hold of high quality and proper information?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly gotten a lot easier. There are most companies, I would say, at this point issue press releases, which aren't always the best, but it's better than nothing. I mean, it's very hard to report on something if you don't know what's happening. And so it's not like it used to be. I mean, back when, Jose and I first met, Twitter was a better way of me getting, tipped off about a potential news story than my email account is. And that's certainly not the case today. But there are some companies that, don't want to do press releases for any number of reasons. You've got, on one hand, Fuente doesn't really do press releases except for very weird things I've found over the years. But for the most part, if they have a new cigar, it's painful to try to get information from them. And that's coming from someone who I think has a pretty good relationship with a lot of different people at Arturo Fuente. And then there are other companies who, don't do them because they just, for lack of a better term, I don't think they really care. And then there are some that, don't really want to work with Halfwheel for any number of reasons. And those companies are obviously harder to get. But for the most part, it's not too challenging. And the other part is and I'm sure you know this, Reinhard, the longer you do it, the more people you know, and the more people you know, the more people you get introduced to. And then it just becomes a lot easier to find out about things.
Well, now with consumer behavior changing, the way we all go about information and that being so readily available now, I mean, what the younger generation in particular is looking for is frictionless experiences and proper information on the go, on the fly, at every moment. Do you think the industry as a whole has to adapt to that more rapidly and change in that regards? And I guess this is also part of the mission that Halfwheel has been on for so many years. But how do you think the industry could do a better job overall in order to be up to speed with those evolutions?
I don't think for the most part, I think the industry's in a decent place there. I think that there are the areas where I wish we got more information were, there are a lot of people that sell cigars, not retailers, but a lot of people that are, what we consider to be manufacturers. Maybe they don't own a factory, but people who are selling cigars on the wholesale level who don't really know that much about the cigars they're selling. And so that makes it challenging. But my main point here is that, there are some companies who are very descriptive about what tobaccos they're using. And then there are companies who just won't say anything about what tobaccos they're using and where the cigars are made and whatnot. And I don't really think that that's a great thing. I certainly understand the idea of like, if you don't tell anyone where it comes from or what it is, then they don't have any preconceived notions. The only problem with that is that, if Perdomo releases a cigar and says, hey, we're not going to disclose the blend on this, it's like, well, based off of what Perdomo has previously sold, my guess is that it's probably got a lot of Nicaraguan tobacco in the filler, if not exclusively Nicaraguan tobacco, and it's probably offered in 3 different wrappers. And so I don't think that there are many manufacturers that could honestly get away with, we're not going to release any information because we want it to be a blind experience per se. That just doesn't really exist for any established company at this point. but it certainly is annoying. And it's, the cigar I'm smoking today right now is it's the HVC 10th anniversary. It's a cigar that I'm curious about smoking because it has a tobacco Corojo 2012 in it that is not necessarily a new tobacco. It was planted in Cuba a while ago, but it's a tobacco that we're just now starting to see companies disclose that they're using. That's not to say that a company didn't use it in 2020 or 2019 or even earlier. It just means that this is the first sort of year I can recall where people are saying that they're using that tobacco. And so that to me has always been the thing. I mean, the people that are on this chat that have been in this business for a while, they know 12 years ago, very few companies would disclose they were using Mexican tobacco at all. That's not to say that no one was using Mexican tobacco. A lot of people were just not saying it. A lot of people were lying about what they were using. And that's not good because it means that as consumers, whether you're an actual consumer, whether you're a media member who buys and smokes cigars, whether you're a retailer who buys and smokes cigars, whether you're, in the industry as a manufacturer and you buy and smoke cigars from other people, it means that your palate and your understanding of what Mexican tobacco is or what Corojo 2012 is supposed to taste like gets screwed up every time that we don't get this information properly disclosed. And I think that collectively it's a massive disservice to the people that are buying and smoking cigars.
We spoke with manufacturers, growers, and brand owners about this. You brought up Corojo 2012, Mexican San Andres. For a while, it seemed like every cigar had to have a broadleaf out of Connecticut. Are these trends that just come and go? Do you see that over the sort of consolidated set of all the reviews that you do, that it seems like in a certain year everybody has to do shade grown cigars, and then the next year it's back to Mexican San Andres?
I mean, there are some tobaccos that come in and out of vogue for any number of reasons. I'd say right now Cameroon is going through a bit of a renaissance in that regard. But as I've mentioned in a couple of the reviews that I've written of cigars that have got Cameroon wrappers from manufacturers that typically have not used it or disclosed using it, some of that's because really nobody was using Cameroon outside of 5 or 6 companies prior to this. Between Fuente, Altadis General, La Aurora, and a couple others, that was the bulk of the Cameroon that was being used. And then just, particularly in Nicaragua, for example, I mean, the amount of cigars coming out of Nicaragua in the last 10 years with Cameroon is basically non-existent up until maybe a year or two ago. And so there's always usually a footnote that helps to explain it. But a lot of the reasons why you'll see these tobaccos happen, Corojo 2012 was a seed that was developed in Cuba. I think I would imagine in 2012. I'm not entirely sure, but it's not a seed that's been around for 20 years. It's actually a Habano and Corojo hybrid of all things, Habano 92, if I'm not mistaken. But that's a new tobacco. In the case of like, why is it some years where broadleaf gets really popular and maybe shade doesn't? Some of that has to do with the mass market machine made cigar industry and what they're wanting and what they're willing to pay for, because those buyers are substantially larger than even the biggest buyers in this business. And so if they say, hey, we're willing to pay more for shade, then that means there's probably less shade for the premium cigar folks. And there's not really much they can do about it because the economics are just completely different. But in the case of Mexican tobacco, that was for a number of reasons. I think the industry was just sort of wrongly assumed, many people did in the industry, that consumers would not buy something that had Mexican tobacco on it or was disclosed as having Mexican tobacco in it. I remember having a conversation with, a couple of the most prominent non-Cuban manufacturers, and they were talking about how they just didn't feel comfortable in 2011, 2012 selling cigars with Mexican wrappers on it, despite the fact other people were doing it with great success. Also, the quality of Mexican tobacco, I think, dramatically increased. And the other thing that happened was that there was different types of Mexican grown tobacco. It wasn't just one seed or 2 seeds. And so that changes things dramatically. And then I think as people's palates change collectively and as cigars got stronger, Mexican tobacco seemed to work for a lot of those blends. And so that's what led to that increasing. But I don't think it's the case that there's some sort of consortium that meets or cabal that meets every year and says, hey, this is going to be the year of, Ecuadorian Corojo. Um, this isn't like the liquor business when people decide this is going to be the year of Aperol, and so we're just going to make sure every bar in the world serves Aperol spritz.
Good point. Charlie, let's change pace for a little moment. We last week introduced a little segment where we do a rapid fire set of questions to have the chance and get to know you a little better. If possible, I would kindly ask you to briefly answer with just one
Okay.
word or a few words, and then we'll go back to the review component. So let's kick things off. Charlie, first cigar at the age of?
Ooh, I had what was probably not a real Davidoff that was purchased on a beach resort in the Dominican Republic when I was 16. But it did have a very, what I believe is a actual Davidoff band on it, but was probably not a real Davidoff.
Your glass is always half?
I would say probably full. Looks half full at the moment. Yeah.
Tea or coffee?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Tea.
Sweets or salty snacks?
Salty.
Favorite sports team?
I mean, at the moment, Wake Forest's American football team is 8-0, and I'm a season ticket holder, so I guess that qualifies.
Good stuff. What's the most vintage cigar you ever enjoyed?
Ooh, I have smoked stuff from the 20s. I'm not sure if I've smoked anything older than that. I don't really recall exactly what it is.
What was it, if I may ask?
I don't know. There are a couple reviews that I've done for the site of stuff from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, so somebody could probably look it up. But I've definitely smoked some stuff beyond that, sort of in private. But I don't. I've smoked Cubans. I've smoked Clear Havanas. I've smoked some stuff that was just domestically made in America that probably had no Cuban tobacco in it from that vintage. But I don't. Nothing stands out. I haven't smoked a great cigar from the 20s.
What's the last country you visited?
Cuba.
YouTube or Spotify?
YouTube.
What cutter do you normally use?
It is the Fox.
Yeah, the smoking,
knives.
the razor cut.
Yeah.
My favorite cutter as well. Excellent. What's your favorite pairing?
Champagne is the one that I'm always the most interested to try.
I know you're not a big fan of coffee, correct?
I drink espresso once a day. I don't subscribe to the coffee and mild cigars as a good pairing theory.
Blowing rings or not?
I really can't do that with cigars for whatever reason. Every once in a while I can, so not so much.
Good cigar or good company?
Probably good company.
Good stuff. Window or aisle seat?
Window, increasingly.
And the last but most tricky one, what's the capital of Austria?
I'm guessing it's not Vienna, given
it is. Ring a bell there. Perfect. So, Charlie, let's get back to the review stuff, which is probably something that a lot of people see with a rather critical eye, and Halfwheel is known to be amongst the most critical reviewers with sometimes brutally honest and sort of straightforward ratings and reviews. I mean, everybody knows you don't kiss ass, and on the other hand, though, I guess we spoke about balance between industry players and media professionals. I mean, with all due respect, but do you sometimes try to be edgy by design or sort of unapproachable in the way that you present yourself or Halfwheel in general? Or is that just sort of a natural consequence of the way you look at the industry and media in general?
I mean, I definitely think that I present myself as unapproachable a lot of times. But in terms of the reviews, there is no intent. It's whatever happens. I think that one thing that I always try to say whenever this conversation gets brought up in public or in private is no one wants to avoid a bad score more than I do or whoever's doing the review, because that means that I smoked 3 cigars that got a 65 or whatever it got, which means that I probably spent, given how slow I smoke a cigar, at least 6 hours of my life over the course of a week, you know, back to back to back days, smoking 3 cigars that I found to be pretty unpleasant. And then I had to sit down and spend an hour and a half writing a review about how unpleasant the cigar was. And then I published said review. And then, I don't get any pleasure about ruining someone's day or making them feel bad. And I certainly don't get pleasure when that person writes a nasty email or, calls me and starts complaining, or worse yet, starts, complaining about Halfwheel, to other people indirectly. And it's like, I paid for the cigar. I really wish it was a lot better, but, yeah, that's not our job is not to present cigars in the best of light. Our job is to present them how they presented them to us, and then, how they performed when we were smoking them.
When you look back at the history of the reviews that you and your team have come up with, um, what are your perceptions as to how individual preferences from Brooks or Patrick sort of shine through their work and the reviews? Um, are there any sort of identifiable trends or sort of biases from the authors that you can detect? And how would that factor into the overall perception of those reviews?
I don't think that there are many at this point. There aren't a ton of flavors where it's like, oh, Brooks really likes, bittersweet flavors, but Patrick hates them. Or Patrick really likes, 56 ring gauge and above cigars, but Brooks can't stand them. I think collectively, we aren't. None of us are large fans of gigantic cigars, length or ring gauge. But what we've learned over the years, or what we learned maybe in 2012 pretty quickly, was that there are some cigars that, in the sizes that we would sit down and say these are the sizes we really enjoy the most, Lancero, Corona Gorda, Petite Corona, etc. There's cigars that sometimes taste terrible in those ring gauges, but do really well in a 60. And so, would you rather have a bad cigar in a format that's more enjoyable for you, or would you rather have a good cigar in a format that's less enjoyable? And the answer to me is always the latter. I want the cigar to taste and perform the best that it can. And it's not like we're smoking a ton of 80 ring gauge cigars. That might be pushing it a little bit, but a 60 at this point is fine, and a 70 is not my favorite, but is doable. And so I don't think there's a ton of that, because we've just sort of learned that there are mild cigars that can be super flavorful and very complex. There are strong cigars that can be super flavorful and very complex. There are big cigars, small cigars, cheap cigars, expensive cigars, etc. And we've just had enough experiences, on both ends of the spectrum at just about every permutation, to where at this point it really is just somebody picked out some cigars for us to review. We're going to sit down and smoke them and hope that it goes well.
Do you actually think that it's important for the reader to clearly identify a certain profile or a certain way of a reviewer thinking about cigars, perceiving them, and then depicting them in the reviews? Because ultimately, as a consumer, I guess you need to have a certain feeling for, well, I'd much rather read Charlie's reviews because he's sort of in my wheel park, whereas I probably do not align with Coop's palette or John McTavish or whoever it might be. Do you know where I'm coming from? Sort of, you find those people you cling with. Is that important for you to sort of clearly have that profile and being recognized for this is what Charlie likes, or the way he handles himself with those reviews?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my end of it, I don't really read any reviews outside of the ones on Halfwheel. That's done extremely purposely, because, I don't want to read Coop's review of a cigar that I'm going to review next week, because that's going to change my opinions on it going in. I want to try to, we don't review cigars blind, for a number of reasons, but I want to try to have as blind of an experience as I can until I'm done with the review. Um, and I don't. So as a consumer of cigar reviews, I'm kind of useless. As a consumer of other reviews in general, yeah, I think that's if you can find somebody who you agree with more often than not that's reviewing whether it's cigars or restaurants or televisions or whatever it is, then you should, if you can find someone that you agree with, that more often than not, that's helpful. Even if you don't necessarily agree or find the same positives as they do in the individual products. If you like Patrick's reviews, but you don't pick up the same flavor notes that he's mentioning in his reviews, but more often than not, you're agreeing that this is a good cigar and this is a bad cigar and this is an average cigar, as Patrick is saying, then to me that's all you need. I think that reviewers and reviews serve a purpose, but ultimately, as everyone will kind of end up telling you, the only way to find out if you're going to like something is for you to smoke it at the end of the day. And so, they can be helpful if you're forced to choose between one cigar or another cigar, maybe. But beyond that, I think their usefulness is a little bit limited.
I'm Charlie, I also think that there's various different approaches as to why people read reviews in general and why they are being written in the first place. One could be primarily from an analytical and methodical sensory approach. Others probably purely for entertainment, and then some maybe for judgmental reasons. Where do you fall into that?
In terms of writing them or reading them or
Well,
watching them, I
actually
guess.
both, but since you said you're rather useless as a consumer of reviews, I guess the first.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of writing them, we look at reviews at Halfwheel more and more as these are the gateway to the top 25. We are trying to find as best we can, given that we review probably between 250 and 300 cigars in a given year. How do we try to construct in a manner that's somewhat fair? So it's not like we're excluding certain manufacturers or, favoring others. How can we try to construct the most complete top 25 list that we can? Now, that most of the time we don't review a cigar that's going to make the top 25. The basic math says if we review 250 cigars in a year, then that means only 10% of them are going to make the top 25. But in terms of like actually constructing the words, I'm just trying to provide the experience that I got in as hopefully as a relatable manner as possible. I know that Halfwheel, some people find our flavor descriptors to be a bit wild. But we use those flavor descriptors a lot of times referencing food or specific smells to try to explain, like, here's, at the end of the day, it's smoke. It's smoke hitting our palate, whether it's in, the mouth or in the nose. And it's us trying to have our brains find a memory and, relate to that. And so if that means it kind of tastes like pasta, we're going to put that it tastes like pasta because most people know what pasta tastes like, as opposed to me being like, well, on my scale, it's a 7 out of 10 bitter and it's a 3 out of 10 sweet and it's a 4 out of 10 savory, because that's absolutely useless as far as a consumer is trying to interpret that, at least as I see it. As far as me, when I read reviews of other products, because I do that, it varies. Sometimes I'm in a store trying to buy a bottle of wine and I know very little about wine. At least in comparison to cigars. And so it's like, oh, I know almost nothing about this wine. Am I going to be buying a bottle of red that's going to be, too sweet for what I want? Is it going to be, too bitter for what I want? Is this from a producer that, is able to make stuff pretty consistently? Is this somebody that, sometimes makes exceptional wine for the money, but other times kind of has duds? And sometimes it's after I've bought the product and it's like, oh, I wonder if my experience, whether it's with wine or whether it's at a restaurant or whether it's with headphones or whatever, trying to figure out whether or not I'm able to figure out why I like something, in a manner that's consistent with somebody who does this for at least a somewhat professional aspect. Because sometimes I can tell you I like this more than that, but I can't really tell you why.
So if we stick with that example, you looking at wine reviews, are you then searching for somebody who's taking a similar approach to Halfwheel and is probably describing said wine as having notes of overcooked pasta in a light sauce of cherry tomatoes, or do you find yourself looking more in sort of an analytical breakdown?
No, I mean, I'd rather have things that I can relate to because, if we handed out every once on this chat the same cigar and said, hey, I just want you to evaluate this on a 1 to 10, how sweet do you think this cigar is? We're going to get what, 8 different responses, might get 10 different responses. And so everyone's got a different interpretation with what a 10 out of 10 sweetness is and what a 1 out of 10 sweetness is. And so that's kind of useless. But if you say, oh, it's got citrus sweetness as opposed to chocolate sweetness or, just pure sugar sweetness, that's much more helpful to me as a consumer.
Mm. Well, even though other people might probably argue that there needs to be a sort of a clearly defined standard as to what certain parameters can be, whether that's, I mean, strength is probably an easier one where you find clearly differentiable notes of mild, medium, or strong. With others, as you said, it's probably more challenging because it becomes truly subjective as certain aromas and tastes.
But I even think strength is pretty subjective. I mean, um, first of all, I think cigars have gotten a lot stronger in the last 10 years. A cigar, you look at the cigars that we used to think of as super strong. I mean, you can take a very specific example. When Roma Craft came out 10 years ago and came out with Cro-Magnon, that was, single-handedly one of the strongest cigars that I could think of on the market at the time. Now Cro-Magnon's not even the strongest cigar they make, and it's not particularly close. And not only that, but you take somebody like Jose. When Jose was working at La Aurora, strong for La Aurora is very different than strong for Hoya de Nicaragua or strong for Arturo Fuente. And mild for La Aurora is very different than what mild, for somebody like Drew Estate is. And so it's all based off of perspective. And if you only smoke Cuban cigars, then your interpretation of what strong is going to be very different than the person who only smokes La Flor Dominicana.
What's the point then of even, trying to rate cigars and give them points or try to make them somewhat comparable?
Well, I think that in those particular examples, my point is that the scale can be manipulated pretty easily if you choose not to interact with a wide range of products. If we're only evaluating La Flor Dominicanas, our interpretation of strong, our interpretation of earthiness and sweetness and spiciness is very different than if you say, I'm going to smoke cigars from all over the world. And so I think when you get reviewers who do smoke cigars from all over the world and smoke all different sizes of cigars and smoke all different price points of cigars, which, I think most of the established reviewers do, maybe, I would say that there's probably less Cubans represented than there is, in context of how many cigars are sold worldwide because of the embargo and the fact that the Americans not only consume more cigars than everyone else does, but they also, are the producers of more cigar media than everybody else does. Other than with that one caveat, which I think is a decent one, I think for the most part, you're getting people that have wide ranges of experiences and that can try to contextualize it within a pretty large library of the cigars that they've smoked.
Earlier, you mentioned that you do open reviews for a various number of reasons. I wrote about the comparison between and actually making a point for both blind reviews as well as open reviews. What's your take on that, and why do you chose to openly review at Halfwheel?
Well, when we were starting, we debated this, back to something I mentioned earlier. We said we weren't going to just take the two cigar blogs and combine them and call it a day. Everything was on the table, and we probably spent more time talking about how to go about reviewing cigars than any other, sort of singular bullet point. And we considered reviewing cigars blind. We considered reviewing cigars as panels. And ultimately, I advocated that we do neither one of those things. I felt like it was important that rather than having somebody just smoke a cigar, whether that's a panel where you have 5 people smoking one cigar each, or whether that's one person smoking one cigar and being like, here's my rating after smoking one cigar, I felt like it was important that same person gets to smoke, ideally 3 cigars. That seemed like logistically a good number that could be doable, where, it wasn't taking a month to do a cigar review, but also one where, if the cigar had one bad sample, or quite frankly, if it had one good sample, and the other 2 cigars, were the opposite experience, that it would give us the ability to say that, because that's not something that, particularly in 2011 and 2012, you saw a lot of people having the capability of doing. Most people were, either on panels smoking one cigar and calling it a day, or they were just smoking one cigar, maybe 2 cigars and calling it a day. And, anyone that's ever bought a box of cigars, most manufacturers, aren't able to produce 25 out of 25 cigars that are basically the same. Usually there's a couple that don't perform as well, and maybe a couple that perform better. And so it was important to me to try to have that aspect. In terms of the blind stuff, or, rating it without knowing what it is, logistically, that was just too challenging for us. We, even today, I think it would be very tough. We would have to have somebody, quite frankly, who wasn't in our office, who was responsible for buying the cigars. And, I don't even know how we would necessarily go about doing it. I guess we would have to create a list of the potential cigar reviews that we felt like were worthy for Halfwheel to review, and then have that person go and buy the cigars, put different bands on them so we don't know what they are, ship them out to the reviewers, and then after the reviewers are done, tell the reviewers what they need to do. But then it's like, okay, how do we get the photographs that we think are important for these cigars? Like, does that person also need to do the photographs? Because then we got to have a whole photography studio somewhere not in our actual office. And then there's the question of, like, how do you review an Andalusian Bull blind? Because I don't think there's another cigar that looks like that. And, our reviewers aren't idiots. We also are the same ones that write these news stories. Like, if you tell me that, I don't know. For example, there was a story that went up actually 20 minutes ago that Oliva started shipping the Serie V 135th anniversary. I wrote that story today. If I opened up a package of my cigars that I was supposed to be reviewing, and there were different bands on them, and saw the cigar with the weird foot that cigar has, I would know immediately what it is. Like, because, I'm kind of aware what's going on in the cigar business. And so I think logistically, it doesn't really work for us. I think that in a world where it's a magazine and where you're trying to say, okay, we're going to review 15 Robustos this issue, maybe it's a bit easier because the reviewers are getting 15 more or less Robusto cigars. But there are just too many examples where it's like, oh, yeah, I could probably figure out what this is without the band on it. If you're going to review what Halfwheel does, which is almost entirely new cigars.
If I sort of phrase it differently, do you think your perception would be different if you were to smoke the cigar blindly in comparison to being fully aware and cognizant of what you have in front of you?
Yeah, it would be different. I don't know exactly how different, but there's no question it would be different.
A brief question from our dear friend Ian, who's here at the lounge with us. Fire away.
Hi, Charlie. Good to see you. And sorry we won't see you in Nicaragua, but maybe in 2023. Following on what you were saying, I have a few questions. One, Reinhard might have told you that Steve Sacker was on 2 weeks ago and he went on for 3 hours. So I'm happy to listen to you for 3 hours, but maybe we won't beat the record. I think that's probably the record for this show. In terms of consistency of cigars, you mentioned within a box. Do you find that a lot of manufacturers, the cigar that was the number one cigar 3 years ago is quite a different cigar now? That's one question. And the second, if I may, Steve Sacker was very pessimistic about the industry generally, and the big guys, the Altrias and so on, were sort of doing their own thing and not really bothered about the consumer and just, the number of units sold. What's your sort of view of the future of the industry? And are you optimistic, pessimistic, or something else?
As far as the first question, yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. I think that the most challenging part of being a cigar maker is the idea that, unlike in wine, where if you were to get the same wine but four consecutive vintages, so a 2010, a 11, 12, 13, you would expect those bottles to taste differently. And quite frankly, if they tasted the same, you would be a little bit suspect about what happened. Um, Whereas in cigars, our expectation is that a Cohiba, Sigla 4 should taste like a Sigla 4 today. And if I go buy one 5 years from now, it should taste the same. And if I bought one 5 years ago, it should have tasted the same, obviously aging notwithstanding. And that's, really challenging, because that's not really how the environment works. That's not how soil works. That's not how, tobacco develops. And so you see the manufacturers that are capable of doing it. I think Padron is the gold standard when it comes to how do we make cigars taste the same year to year. And what Padron does to do that is they have so much more tobacco than they need to make the cigars that they want to make in a given year. And so that means they can wait till the tobacco is ready, and then they can use that tobacco. They can, if they don't like how the tobacco they can get rid of it without affecting the number of cigars they're going to make in a given year, et cetera, et cetera. It also helps that, Padron doesn't make that many different types of blends compared to most manufacturers. As far as the second question goes, I'm probably a bit more optimistic than Steve Saka on most things. I think the industry has been given a pretty nice gift, as most luxury consumable segments have with COVID. Sales are booming. I mean, I've been telling people for the last year, if you can't sell cigars right now, you definitely shouldn't be in the cigar business, because it's not going to be any easier than it is right now, at least as far as I can tell. And so I think that's been helpful. But there obviously are a number of challenges. I'm more concerned with the government end of things than how companies are making decisions. There are a lot of, not just the FDA or the EU, but there's an election, quasi-election, I guess, in Nicaragua very shortly that could have massive implications, depending on if the Western countries decide to introduce new sanctions against Nicaragua. Certainly, what's gone on there over the last few years is from their own issues internally, has caused a number of problems. It's also just not good to be manufacturing, have a country that's that important in the manufacturing landscape that I don't think is very stable. And so that to me is the greater threat. And it's also a much larger threat because that's not something that we have as much control over. If Altadas wants to, or General wants to do things differently, they can sort of do things differently without having to ask for many people. That's a very different story than whether it's FDA or Daniel Ortega or whoever.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Ian.
Ian, many thanks. And Eric, who's watching us over on the Facebook live stream, asked, has any brand, without naming them, obviously, ever influenced or pressured you into giving a certain type of review?
I mean, yeah, there are plenty of people that have tried. I think that, we've never done anything that, if my emails got leaked to the world, there's nothing in there that would be salacious as far as reviews are concerned. There might be some food ordering habits that people have some questions about, but other than that, as far as the reviews go, I'm comfortable with everything that we've done. But yeah, there have been manufacturers that have reached out and said, hey, how much money does it cost to get a cigar reviewed? Hey, is there any way we can send you cigars, and if you don't like them, you don't say anything about them? This year we finally sort of put an end to free samples of any kind, so that reduces things quite dramatically. But yeah, I mean, there are plenty of instances. There are instances, I mean, Eric Espinoza likes to joke around. He says that he wants the only rating he wants from Halfwheel is a 69. That's, I don't think, as serious as certainly ethically, it's not as serious as a lot of other complaints. But yeah, it happens, and I'm sure Halfwheel's not the only one that's experienced that.
I mean, people often argue that only bad news is good news, right? And as much as I understand that you don't enjoy smoking three, well, rather obvious 69s in straight succession, and then having to write about them is a pleasant experience. But I mean, as a media professional, your reviews and what you put into wording can almost make or break a business, which ultimately could have a severe impact on somebody's financial situation, lifetime achievement, whatever you want to call it. How do you feel about that responsibility that you clearly have on your shoulder as well?
I mean, I don't think that we can break a company. We've never tried, so I can't say for certain. But even with a small company, I just don't think that's the case. I think that at the end of the day, if you're a company and even if just half of your consumers read Halfwheel, that's not a good, like, you're not making very many cigars. I mean, we have a pretty wide audience, but in the context of the cigar market, you're going to need a lot more people than just our readership to make it work, because the other fact is our readership is pretty fickle and likes to buy all sorts of other things and whatnot. So I don't think we can break a manufacturer. I don't think we can, at the end of the day, if we review a cigar and it doesn't get a good rating, that's one rating. It's not like, this isn't a process where in order to go into a retail store, you have to read Halfwheel's rating and then make a decision about whether or not you're going to buy a cigar. I do think that we have the ability to help manufacturers, particularly when it's people that are less heralded, newer companies or companies that have been around but haven't had as much publicity or good publicity. Um, but I try not to think about it because it's not really what we're trying to do. We're trying to be as independent as possible from that. And it's also not our responsibility. It's not my responsibility to help you sell cigars. It's my responsibility to say what I think happened. It's my responsibility to not lie. It's my responsibility to try to treat every cigar the same, review to review. But ultimately, it's somebody else's job to sell cigars, not mine.
In conjunction to that, even as an independent media, all publications are somewhat dependent on industry money. And we all know that as consumers, first and foremost, we all have our cognitive biases, and it's next to impossible to get rid of them. And I guess the very same is true for a publication in a larger instance. Do you think that ultimately media can still consider itself independent to the core, or is there always going to be some sort of a link where it becomes tricky to sort of truly remain independent?
I mean, I think we're at a point, not just with cigars, where media outlets are going to be taking money from people that they write about, or even more so, people that they're in business with. You take somebody like Sky Sports in Europe or ESPN in the US, they are simultaneously broadcasting the sports teams that they write about. And maybe it's not the same people. Usually it's not the same people making those decisions, but those conflicts of interest exist at pretty much every media outlet you see, unless you see a media outlet who has no advertisers and just takes money from its readers, which unfortunately, the internet has brought us many great things. But one of the things that it's done for the media landscape is that it got people very accustomed to not paying for anything. Media. And so, I don't know of a cigar thing that whether it's a YouTube channel or a blog or a newsletter or a magazine who, doesn't take ads or doesn't take free samples, and only charges its readers or viewers or listeners, and that's the only way that it makes money, that is at any sort of scale. So, I don't think in our industry that's going to really exist. What I can tell you at Halfwheel, this is not something we intentionally do. It just kind of is the way the chips have fallen over the years. If you go and look at our top 25 list in the last few years, the majority of the cigars on the top 25 list are from companies that don't advertise with us. And the majority of our advertisers don't have cigars in the top 25 list. And so, once again, it's not intentional. It's just kind of the way things have gone the last few years. It's been very helpful because anytime these conversations come up, I can always point to that as a pretty clear example that, there does not seem to be a case where you can just buy your way onto the top 25 list. And that's something we've been fortunate to the game plan that we had of how we sell ads and how we do reviews, and the sort of timeline that existed for Halfwheel has meant that we've developed a reputation where that's going to be what it's going to be. And so I don't think companies are expecting us to, because they've suddenly started spending money with us, just to start saying nice things about their products. And if they are, I think they get pretty rudely awakened, because that's just not how we operate.
Appreciated. Cy Sweeney had a couple of questions. Cy's here with us at the lounge as well, so you fire away, Cy.
Hi, Reinhard, everybody. Good to see you this week. Last couple of weeks been crazy, so I haven't had the chance to get on. Just a couple of questions. Just one from the start there was, you were saying at a young age you were in college and all that, and so I was just wondering, how did you adapt yourself to finding flavors, notes, etc., when you were reviewing a cigar? And such things as the profiles of the cigar, and of course what you found with the accessories you were using, and what made you think people would take notice of your information, what you put out there. Also, the second question was, if you can, I also noticed on your list of top cigars in 2020, 4 of the top 5 were gauges less than 50. Is it to do with the better notes and flavors of the smaller gauge, or was it geared on what gauges Halfwheel thought the trend for the customers, thought of influencing the consumers at now? Because in Europe we have the Robusto, the most popular cigar and all that, or was it just the way they fell when you were reviewing them?
Yeah, as far as the first question is concerned, getting my palate to understand flavors, that was something where I was asking the retailers that I was buying cigars from, I liked this cigar and I didn't like this cigar, and they seemed like there were some similarities there. Maybe they were made by the same company, or maybe they were the same size. Why is it the case that I like this one more than the other one? And then, if I liked this one and didn't like this one, do you have a recommendation about what you think I might like next? And from there, it just became okay, well, maybe you like this wrapper, maybe you like this ring gauge more because it allows you to smoke the cigar at a cooler temperature at a slower rate, and that can reduce the amount of harshness and sort of pepper burning sensations. As far as like me evaluating whether or not anyone would care what I thought, it wasn't, I started the cigar blog just because I was interested about cigars, and I had some experience in media before, and it was a good way for me to, sort of express at the time my hobby. And I found it more interesting when I was writing about it and forcing myself to learn about it. And then it sort of spiraled out of control into what it is today. As far as the second question goes, I had no idea, maybe I did at some point, but I hadn't really considered the idea that there were 3 under 50 ring gauge cigars on this list. In short, that's how the chips fell. Looking at these cigars, we've got the Taiwan Karloff was the winner. The Taiwan Black Label Petit Corona was number 2. The Aventura, so the Queen's Pearls. the Sobremesa Brulee, and then the Davidoff the Year of the Ox, which I believe is the thickest of the bunch.
Yeah.
I mean, the Brulee, I'm pretty convinced has a sweet tip on it. So, trying to find similarities between these 5 cigars is, you found one that I hadn't thought of. But I mean, you take the 2 Taiwahes, they're 2 very different cigars. The different wrappers, the one's is a sub 50 ring gauge, but is a pretty large cigar in terms of its length. The other one is one of the smallest cigars Taiwan's ever made. So no, it wasn't deliberate. It was just kind of how things went. And I mean, in the case of the Karloff, the Brulee, and the Davidoff, those were the only ring gauges. There was only one cigar for that release. So, it wasn't like we had an option to choose the thinner ring gauge or the thicker ring gauge.
Yeah, because I seen that Carrillo were saying they bought out the pledge in a 58 gauge. I don't know if it was today or it was yesterday or whatever. And he said that if he bought it out in the 60, it wouldn't be as good in flavor wise. And so it's amazing that the little a tiny difference can make such a difference. But I just wanted to ask you one last question on the human element and the legislation. As Halfwheel is so popular, have you or the guys considered doing, as you say, with journalism and all that, any articles lately on the detrimental effect of too much legislation will have on the people whose only livelihood in the Latin American countries is working in the cigar industry?
No, I mean, we haven't really pondered that before. I think that there are, I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to, the socioeconomics of, the Dominican Republic or Cuba or Nicaragua or Honduras or wherever. But, I suspect that a lot of these workers would find other work. It may not be the work that they want, but quite frankly, working in the cigar industry may not be the work that they want. I do think that the legislation has impacts on them, but I think in that particular instance, I think the legislation isn't as impactful as, are the companies themselves doing their job properly? The legislation collectively has some big impacts, but at the end of the day, if a company, decides that they're going to cut costs, that usually will have a negative impact on the product. If it doesn't, quite frankly, then there are some other questions to be had. And so we see certain companies where, I don't know if it's cost cutting or whatever, but where the quality goes down and then it maybe goes back up, or maybe it stays down and that company sort of falls off the map. And to me, that's always kind of the bigger impact. But certainly in the case of like Nicaragua, I mean, I think that the government impact of these jobs in Nicaragua is not FDA or European Union related. That is very much related to Nicaragua's own set of problems and how that country is being run.
Because Nicaragua has developed so much over the last few years in the cigar industry. I mean, in that it's done so well, and it'd be a shame to see it go back just because of massive legislation or because of the government of the country. But just one final little thing on your, you mentioned earlier about, finding blends off people and what goes into cigars. But if manufacturers gave out exact blends of popular great selling cigars or a cigar that sells well, wouldn't that leave the industry open more to copycatting now? And as you probably know, there's approximately 15,000 plus cigar brands out there at the moment. So if Halfwheel started printing all the blends, you guys would be printing forever, you'd be putting stuff out there forever.
I mean, I think that the information that I'm asking for is just, tell me what ingredients you're using with some specificity. I'm not asking for, if you were making a cigar blend at a factory like Plasencia, you've got, you just take Corojo 98. So Corojo 98 is a seed, which, Plasencia's Corojo 98 may not be the exact same as Aganorsa's Corojo 98. It probably is not. But from there, you've got, where is it going to be grown? Which country is it going to be grown? And then from the country, which region? In Nicaragua, you could take that exact same seed, and if you grow it in Jalapa versus Condega versus Esteli, and certainly if you grow it in Ometepe, it's going to be different. And then from there, you've got the priming. So where on the plant does it fall? Is it up here in the Ligero, or is it down here? Is it a Viso or a Seco? Then you've got how much of it are you going to put inside of the cigar. And even from there, a lot of the farmers will tell you that, you could be in Jalapa, but we have one plot of land over here and we have another plot of land over here, and they're 500 meters away from each other, but the tobacco tastes completely different out of the two of them, even if it's the same seed, the same priming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got, well, how did that tobacco get processed? And companies like Plasencia or Aganorsa or Oliva, they sell their tobacco to any number of companies, and the tobaccos don't come out the same. If you give, Hoya de Nicaragua, Corojo 98 from Aganorsa, and you were to give AJ Fernandez the tobacco, and you were to give, Quesada the tobacco, it would not taste the same, even though the tobacco was the same at one point. And then you've got the cigar, what's the percentage? Are you using a half a leaf? Are you using a quarter leaf? What are the other types of tobaccos you're using? What's the ring gauge of the cigar? You mentioned that, 2 ring gauge would affect it. The other thing I've found over the years is that even the length, which doesn't seem like something that should affect it, a Robusto and a Toro with the same ring gauge oftentimes don't taste the same. There's a lot of similarities, but usually they don't taste identical. And so I don't think that disclosing we're using Jalapa Corojo 98 is going to be giving away much of anything. There are some instances when it probably would, particularly if you're using a tobacco that a lot of people aren't. If you're using Panamanian tobacco, then yeah, maybe, because most people aren't using Panamanian tobacco, and therefore they've just never really considered it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Charlie. Charles,
thanks for the questions.
Good answers. Appreciate it.
So thank you for the question. And also one thing I just wanted to add to that is I guess even if you take the very same ingredients and you put it into two people's hands, they will come out totally different because there's so many variables in terms of nature and even personality that you put in there. And to give you another analogy, I mean, me having worked at the world's best bars and with the world's best chefs, everybody sort of has the same recipe to a classic Manhattan cocktail or a risotto milanese. Yet there's a reason why you go to one restaurant instead of the other. So I guess even if you clearly and most openly confess what's your base recipe, it'll still come out differently from one person's hands as to the other. But that's just my 2 cents. Jose, you wanted to add something.
Yes, definitely. Charlie, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Jose?
Good. We've known each other for, I would say, 11, 12 years. Charlie, something, I follow a lot of media. I see sometimes when you're on some shows, I see Coop, I see Ape, Cigar Authority, everybody. One thing that nobody wants to talk about, and I know you're very inquisitive on researching, and part of what Halfwheel does is, I would say it's very unique. So let's say that it seems that the 96 billion that they're looking, tobacco is not going to be in it for the moment. We don't know what's going to happen with FDA regulations. But what nobody wants to address, let's say FDA goes clear, they give us a break. What are your thoughts on the predicate date of 2007 that nobody wants to talk about and everybody avoids it? I would like to hear your 2 cents on that.
I don't think the predicate date is changing. FDA has been pretty clear that it doesn't believe it has the authority to change the February 15, 2007 date. Their argument is that because U.S. Congress included that in the original law, that Congress would need to be the one to change it. And, realistically, the idea that Congress is going to go back in and just change that seems pretty limited, particularly if they change that, it has implications for e-cigarettes and other products that I don't think, it opens a mess up that from a lobbying perspective, I don't think the cigar industry has any say in, quite frankly. I mean, the e-cigarette people and the anti-health people on the e-cigarette side would have far more money to throw at that than the cigar industry would. I think the larger question is how they interpret the predicate date. We don't really have a great amount of evidence about that because substantial equivalence for premium cigars is not currently into effect. And so, to try to explain it to a whole bunch of the non-American / non-industry people, currently the theory is that if you have a cigar that was on the market prior to February 15, 2007, that cigar is good. FDA is going to approve that cigar without much testing or anything like that. And then there's a question of if you have a cigar that's similar to that cigar, that maybe you could say, hey, look, we sell this product. It uses the same ingredients as this other product from February 15, 2007 that you've approved. It's the same wrapper, it's the same binder, it's the same filler tobaccos. It's just a different ring gauge, or maybe it's a different percentage of the filler tobaccos. And we think FDA should approve it because you've already basically approved a very, very similar version of this product. The question to me is, how strictly does FDA want to look at that? If they say, okay, you gave me the list of ingredients and the list of ingredients are the same, we don't really care about the ring gauge or the length or whatever, it's approved, then that's one world. If FDA looks at it and says, unless it's truly an identical product, then we're not going to approve it without you going through all this other hassle, that's a very different world. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of ability to guess what FDA is going to do right now because these applications have been put on hold.
But the follow-up on that, let's say that it would go all against us. What do you think the impact would be for the companies that could not comply with that don't have the predicate date?
Well, the companies that don't have the predicate date, then it becomes a question of what does substantial equivalence look like for cigars, which we also don't know. And so it's tough for me to say. Look, it certainly is the companies that, regardless of what FDA does, the companies that have the products that have been out, since February of 2007 are at a massive advantage. But I also think that the bigger advantage is the companies that have those products and have their own factories, because those companies, at the end of the day, if they really wanted to, and I don't know how FDA would possibly regulate it, if, Padron, for example, says, hey, look, we've got Padron 1964 and Padron 1926. Next year, we're coming out with Padron 2022. For the record, this is not happening. As far as I know, I've never spoken to Padron about what they're planning on doing next year. But let's say they came out with Padron 2022. Well, Padron could go to FDA and say, hey, look, it's the exact same thing as 1926. We're just calling it 2022, but it's the same tobaccos. We grow them, in Nicaragua. We roll the cigars in Nicaragua. It's the same size as whatever. The only thing that's different is we're just calling it Padron 2022. I don't know how FDA would go about regulating that and saying, oh, no, that's actually a new product. If Padron signs a piece of paper and says, hey, it's the same thing, then FDA's got to sort of adhere to it. And as of right now, there doesn't seem to be much indication that FDA going into a factory in Nicaragua is anywhere close to being on the horizon. And there would be a lot of legal ramifications, I think, if they wanted to try to do that. So those companies that have the predicate products and also have factories and quite frankly, farms, they're going to have a massive advantage because they can just keep saying, oh, it's just the same thing that we were doing in 2007, wink, wink. And I don't think FDA can really stop them.
Thanks.
Charlie, one thing that I would like to say is no matter if people read Halfwheel or not, whether they agree with your perspectives or the way that you do reviews, one thing that I think the entire industry and consumers have to give you massive credit for is the way you manage to most thoroughly research all the legal aspects and what's going on in the industry, and how in the most consumer friendly and digestible way you present those information to the cigar community. And for that, I wanted to personally thank you, because I think solely when it comes to that legal aspect, Halfwheel by far is the number one source of credible information. And you do an excellent job on that.
No, I really appreciate it. And it's something we've put a lot of work into. It's something that is not a fun part of our job, but it's nice that it's appreciated. It's also nice that, at the end of the day, the best work that Halfwheel does is the stuff that it does regarding legislation, whether that's FTA, whether that's local legislation in the US, which Patrick does a lot of, or whether that's international legislation, which we don't do as much of as we do the US stuff, but we try to do it when we see it. Because, if you read a cigar review and you go out and buy a cigar, that's great for the cigar company. But it's a lot more important if a consumer reads an article on Halfwheel about upcoming legislation and then contacts somebody, in the government and says, hey, I don't agree with this legislation, or maybe I do agree with this legislation. And, similar to us writing about new cigars coming out, the only way that conversation can happen with a government is if the consumer knows about it. And so, I always think that that's the most impactful work that we do.
No, congratulations on that. Another point where I very much agree with you is being in favor of traditional smaller vitolas and classical shapes when it comes to cigars. Do you think that, be it on the size matter or just in general and on a more holistic perspective, the industry is going off rail in certain regards with trends or shifting consumer behaviors and the way that manufacturers react to it?
No, I mean, if consumers are going to buy it, then you're in the business of selling cigars, so you should make it. If consumers aren't going to buy it, then that's maybe a different story. But I've yet to see a manufacturer say, hey, we're getting rid of all of our sub 50 ring gauge cigars and we're only going to make 60s. I know that the people that smoke Cuban cigars would be like, well, Habanos has gotten rid of pretty much every single sub 46 ring gauge cigar, or nearly all of them, and keeps adding larger and larger sizes. But it's not like Habanos said, we're getting rid of all of our sub 46 ring gauge cigars or I guess getting rid of all of our sub 54 ring gauge cigars. We're just making 60s going forward. That would be one thing. That being said, I look at La Gloria Cubana's portfolio from a Cuban perspective and go, all the cigars that I used to like from La Gloria Cubana have all been discontinued, and that's really unfortunate.
Do you think that the industry needs more marketing or less marketing?
I mean, as someone that pays my bills from marketing, I guess more, but I don't know. I think it needs better marketing, right? Like, whether it's things like this or whether it's, a more consistent commitment to social media, or whether it's better events in person or virtually, I think that's always the thing. And it's the consistency thing that's the tough part. It's easy to do something once. It's hard to do it every day of the week or on any sort of regular basis. But I don't know if it necessarily needs more marketing.
The better component is certainly the one that sticks. Closing the legal and regulatory segment, Charlie, one final question that I had in mind for quite a while is regarding the Jenkins Act. Do you see that as a potential or big threat to larger retailers in the US and sort of the way online and physical presence are in balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the online retailers, which is the growing part of this business, that is a space that has largely not been regulated, and that just means that it's probably going to get more regulated. So whether it's the Jenkins Act or whether it's in the U.S. right now, the big thing facing online retailers is the local taxes. So in the U.S. you have a federal tax that gets put on all cigars, and then you have a state tax in most states. There are a handful of states, or less than a handful, 3 states, and then Washington, D.C., that don't have an added cigar tax. But everywhere else does. The problem that these online retailers have is a combination of it's really a technological one. And so, in pretty simplistic terms, the issue they have is that a cigar in Florida doesn't have that added tax. A cigar in Texas does, though it's pretty minor. It's 1.1 cents, so it's more or less nothing. A lot of retailers don't even add it. They just eat the cost because it's a very little amount of money at the end. But in a state, like New York, it's a lot more than 1.1 cents. It's a percentage-based tax. And so the problem is that if you're a consumer and you go online to go buy a cigar from, charliescigarshop.com, which does not exist to my knowledge, certainly is not my cigar shop, but let's say I had one. Well, in Florida, if a cigar is $10, it's $10 at the end of the day. In New York, I can't sell that cigar for $10 and make the same amount of money. I need to be able to sell it for the $10 with the tax or plus the tax. The problem is I need a piece of software that can display to consumers in New York a different price. And then I need to figure out a way that it always does that. So that way you don't, as a consumer, go on the website one day and get the New York price and go on the website the next day and get the Florida price and then think that I've been screwing you out of money for the last 15 years. And from what I understand, that technology just really doesn't exist because this is a pretty unique problem. And then there's a whole bunch of accounting and paperwork issues that complicate this even more. But the biggest issue is you need to make sure that the consumer is seeing the price that you're actually going to charge them, depending on the state that they're in. And that just doesn't seem to exist from an e-commerce environment. I know that a lot of the large retailers in the US are working on it, but from what I understand, it's a massive headache and is likely going to require, what I'm guessing is a more than $1 million investment in trying to get that technology to work and function consistently.
One question I'm sure you get asked quite a bit, but large media houses at some point always go print and physical, and Cigar Journal has it, Aficionado has it. Why not Halfwheel? Is print ever something that you discuss with your team?
Yeah, I mean, it was discussed just sort of as a, these are the things you think about, but never seriously. I think that, when we started Halfwheel, we weren't trying to make a business that was going to support multiple full-time jobs out of it. So there wasn't that, but also, none of us have any background in printing and those sorts of things. It just seems like a lot of added work and a potential for us to lose money. I also, quite frankly, think that the magazines, whether it's in cigars or in general, fewer and fewer people are buying hard copies of things. I oddly, would much rather read the physical newspaper. When I go to read a book, I buy the physical book as opposed to getting something for my iPad. I just find it a lot easier for me to consume it that way. But all of the trends in publishing say that is just not at all the case collectively.
Charlie, before we wrap things off, I wanted to wholeheartedly thank you for taking the time and joining us today, answering all these questions with so much insight and patience. As a final question, we started with the ethics of journalism, the way you look at the industry, the evolution of Halfwheel. Let's take a peek into the crystal ball. First, on the industry side, whether you're bullish or bearish for the future of the cigar world on a more holistic terms. And secondly, when you think about Halfwheel and the next couple of years, what are the things that you would love to see, or the things you would love to make even more of a contribution for the cigar world and have more of an impact on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm decently bullish on the cigar industry. I mean, I think that it's not going to continue at the pace that we've seen over the last 18 months or so. I think that's a bit of an aberration. I don't remember the last show I was on when I was forced to make a prediction about when that comes to an end, but I certainly don't think that this time next year cigars are going to be selling at the rate that they're currently selling at, and certainly not what they were selling at a year ago. And that's, not because of anything the cigar industry is going to do. That's just the sort of, as we, sort of get to a more manageable part of the pandemic, consumer behavior is likely to shift back to where it was pre-pandemic, or at least get closer to where it was compared to, full-on lockdown mode. As far as, beyond the pandemic side of things, I mean, I think that we're seeing retailers get better, whether that's on the internet or whether that's with, in the US, we're seeing a lot more cigar bars opening. which I think is the key to making brick and mortar work. You know, you need to be able to make money off of the people that are sitting in the lounge, and that's not done by selling them one cigar. That's done by selling them one cigar and then selling them some drinks as they sit there and smoke the cigar. And so I think that is the, you know, that's the way that retail is going to work. I think there will be shops that only sell cigars, or maybe they sell cigars and alcohol, but they don't allow you to consume them on premise. That's a different story. But I think more and more the successful shops are going to be the ones that have lounges where they can sell you drinks. And you know, I also think that as we have the natural progression of the retailers that were around in the 90s and during the cigar boom, you know, as they, you know, sort of phase out and retire, and we get people that are, you know, closer to you and I's ages, entering, you know, they're going to have new ideas, and they're going to look at their consumers, you know, through their lens, which is a lot different than someone that's twice my age. And so it's not to say that's always going to be better, but I do think that that IX player might have committed a red card there, although apparently VAR disagrees with me. But I do think that you know, there's going to be some improvements and some new ways to look at the world. As far as Halfwheel and, you know, what I'd like to see us do, you know, there's not really any grand plans in terms of, you know, we're not going to launch a vodka or mezcal blog next year. We had a beer blog. It did not go as planned, and we shut it down. But you know, we're trying to make improvements to the product that we're making. And so one of the big projects this year has been, oddly, I don't think it was a complaint that many people had, but we've spent a lot of time and money investing in our studio photography. And I think the results of what we're seeing today, you know, is substantially better than where it was 8 months ago. So it's always going to be about getting better, whether that's writing or photography or what we're covering and those sorts of things. You know, that's the goal. And you know, I hope that we can, whenever the next evolution happens, I hope that Halfwheel survives it. I hope that we're able to, you know, adapt and you know, not get left behind like so many other publications have. Oh, look, Dortmund scored a penalty kick. So you know, that's the sort of the question is what's next? You know, it's probably not TikTok, but there's something else coming on the internet. And you know, are we going to be able to not only prosper, but also maybe just survive it?
Charlie, I'm sure you're well prepped and multitasking with Dortmund on the screen.
There's a very large screen behind me, so it's helpful.
I'm sure you will do an excellent job in regards to whatever comes next. And one thing's for sure, the industry is in a very interesting state right now, and lots of moving parts, lots of things happening, and it's exciting to be part of it. I'm honored to have shared this session with you. Many thanks for everything that you shared with us. All the very best for you personally and for Halfwheel and the continued success story of your platform and your publications. My best regards to your team as well. And I'm looking forward to catching up soon and then hopefully smoking a cigar together again. So many thanks to you and all the very best. Charlie Minato.
Me as well. Thank you, Reinhard.
Pleasure.
Charlie, great session.
Great show indeed.